In Genesis 29, Jacob is on the run from his murderous brother Esau, and he finds himself in his mother's homeland. He's about to meet his wife, actually, but before he does, he's going to do something that foreshadows the resurrection of Jesus. See, Jacob is about to become the cause of some major sister rivalry, and it's going to be a struggle for power that's similar to Jacob and Esau's struggle in their mother's womb. See, if you can learn to ask the right questions, then you're going to see things you've never noticed in the scriptures. Maybe this kind of Bible study is new for you, but I believe this small chapter is about to come alive for you like never before. And after this study, I don't believe you'll read this chapter the same ever again. Let's go to Genesis 29. Since this is a Bible study on Genesis chapter 29, we're going to look at every single verse and recognize specific details as we build up to the main point of this video. So my encouragement is be patient. Don't skip ahead to the end or you're going to miss out on the entire context and the framework that really provides understanding for the main point of this video. So just to keep things in context, here's what has happened in the last chapter. Jacob finds himself on the run to the land of his mother as a kind of foreigner, but along the way he rests at a place called Bethel. That's what happened in the last chapter, right? Where God unexpectedly encounters Jacob in a dream, and in this dream God extends the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob as the next patriarch. And so Jacob realizes the sacredness of that moment and place, and he sets up a pillar to God and names the place Bethel. So to summarize this chapter now, Jacob's on the run still, finds himself in Padan Aram, where he's going to live with his uncle Laban and works for him for over 20 years in order to marry one of his daughters, Rachel. Laban tricks Jacob, and Jacob ends up marrying both of his daughters, so he ends up with two wives. And one of those wives will end up bearing children for Jacob, while the other one remains barren. So there's going to be a family feud, and before all of this happens, Jacob is going to make some interesting moves to impress Rachel early on as he enters Padan Aram, and that's where Jesus and the resurrection will come in. All right, so I've set the tone. There's the foundation. It says, Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. So just to notice, Jacob is said to come from a different people than who he's currently going to, right? These are the people of the east. He's not associated with them. He doesn't belong to them anymore, right? This is merely the land of the east where his mother comes from, right? But it's not just the land of the east. These are the people of the east, as if to say Abraham's father's household, that's associated with the east, right? But the new people, the new family of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and their descendants are not associated with the east. They are a different people, right? So as he looked, he saw, what did he see? He saw a well. He saw a well, specifically it's in a field, and behold, I don't know why there's three, but there's 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. This is going to be important. And so why are there 3 flocks? No idea. But we know that these flocks are waiting for water, which comes at a certain time when someone would remove the stone on the well's mouth, which was large, so that the flocks could be watered. This is similar to how Abraham's servant, remember Abraham's servant Abraham sends a servant to get a wife for his son Isaac. Isaac is the father of Jacob, right? So Abraham already sent a servant here. Now it's Jacob being sent here, right? Not just a servant. And we're specifically told that the stone on the well's mouth, it's actually large. Why are we told the size of this stone? Well, I think it's to emphasize how it's blocking access to the water. But this stone obviously covers the water, keeps it back from the animals, and the stone is removed periodically by the shepherds at the right time to water their flocks. So that's the context. That's what Jacob's walking into. And when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well. This is the cultural context. And they would water the sheep and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. Right? So we have a water source that's covered by a stone that needs to be removed by someone. Jacob is about to say, my brothers, after he sees when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds roll. So Jacob says to these shepherds, my brothers, where do you come from? And they said, we are from Haran. Jacob would know that's where Abraham came from. So I must have made it to my mother's homeland. So Jacob associates with them, right? He doesn't actually belong to that family anymore, He's not associating with that land, but he's still on the level of them being kind of distant relatives. He goes, "Hey, brothers," and he says to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said, "We know him." Laban is about to be a key figure, this son of Nahor. Nahor is the brother of Abraham. Okay, so Laban is Jacob or Abraham's nephew, technically. And they said, "We know him." He said, "Is it well with him?" They said, "Yeah, it's well. And see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. So we're about to see a shepherdess." While Abraham sent his servant, remember that these stories parallel each other, and we can't miss the context. But this is the third generation now. Jacob, and then his father Isaac, then his father Abraham. Abraham sent a servant years ago to find a bride for his son Isaac. That servant came to this same land to find a wife, who ends up being Rebekah, right? The servant sees Rebekah coming with water, and then she ends up watering his camels. Now it's Rachel coming with sheep instead of water, and Jacob's going to be the one to water the flocks. Okay? He said, "Behold, it is still high day. It's not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But they said, I don't know if you can read it, sorry. But they said, we can't. Not until all the flocks are gathered together. Then the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. So as Jacob is entering into his mother's land, there's this story about a well and water. There's a shepherdess coming. She's attractive. Jacob's liking what he sees. And Rachel's unable to water her flocks because it's not the right time. It's not the right setting for that to happen. All the flocks have to be gathered first. Then the stone is rolled away. The question is, who rolls it away, though? Presumably, one of the shepherds, once all the flocks have been gathered. Okay? So that's the cultural context. Here's the setting. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep. Well, we already know this, but just in case you missed it, she was a shepherdess. Okay? Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, right? And the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. An emphasis on their relationship. Who is Laban? Well, Laban is Jacob's mama's brother. It's important to know that. So Rachel doesn't yet recognize him. We're going to see later on in John 4, Jesus meets a woman at a well. Jesus comes to his own people. Jesus comes to Israel. They don't recognize him. They don't perceive who he is, even though he's offering them living water. In the same way, Rachel, a distant relative of Jacob, not too distant, but she's not going to recognize who he is because she's never met him. Right? So how is she supposed to recognize him? But this whole idea of Jacob being at a well, rolling a stone away so the flocks can receive water, it is very similar, or rather Rachel specifically in her flocks as a woman in mind, so that a woman can have her flocks watered. It's very similar to what Jesus does spiritually, right? So we think about how Jesus offers living water in John chapter 4. And the reason I go here is because in John chapter 4, I know we're really far from John chronologically here, but in John 4, the woman at the well is going to reference Jacob personally and say, this, Jacob's well, and Jesus will use that as a bridge to explain who he is and what he does. And so there's a clear connection between Jesus and Jacob beyond their physical descent, beyond their biology, right? Jesus is a descendant of Jacob, but beyond that, there's a connection when it comes to watering and well. And if we think about Jesus offering living water, okay, the only way that water, spiritual life, can be offered to the people of God is through the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. He has to live for us, die for us, be resurrected. That tomb has to be emptied, but he does have to go into the tomb. And so if we go fast forward to the end of the Gospels, the tomb, the stone that blocked the tomb, is rolled away so that Jesus and the eternal abundant life he offers us comes emanating out of that tomb, and it's offered to humanity via Jesus' death and resurrection. Right? His stone has to be rolled away, and then he can offer true living water to his people, that is life with God, not just life from God, but a life with God. And so that's somewhat foreshadowed in what Jacob is doing here. Is that a stretch? Let me know in the comments. I don't believe it is, because of the explicit and direct connections in the New Testament between Jacob and Jesus. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. And as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, there's rumors, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him. What does he do? He meets him. He embraces him. He kisses him. He brings him into his house. This is not how Laban will treat Jacob when Jacob ends up leaving, which will be in a couple chapters. So this is exactly what happened the last time one of, not Jacob's relatives, but Abraham sent a servant to go and find a wife for Isaac, right? Flocks are watered, identities are revealed, weeping happens. The girl, Rebekah, ends up running to tell the news to her father. Same thing here. It's like a copy and paste situation. And so if we think about it, there is a similar story, because as we read the Old Testament, we do want to read the Old Testament in light of the New and vice versa, right? So there's a similar story involving this kind of scene. And it's not a historical narrative. It's a parable Jesus gives. It's the parable of the prodigal son, where the father does this exact same thing to his prodigal son who returns home, right? You know, the father will meet him, embrace him, kiss him, bring him to his house, dress him up, treat him, lavish him. And now we see Jacob, who is cut off from his home as a kind of stranger in a foreign land, but he's being welcomed there more than he's being welcomed back home with his older, jealous, murderous brother who's waiting to kill him. And so Jacob here is a kind of prodigal, not in terms of him sinning and running away from his family, but in terms of him being cut off and estranged from his home and family. He's not returning back home in the promised land. He's returning to his mother's original home, even though he's never been there before. And so it is a kind of reunion. It is a kind of image of what we see in the prodigal son. Though the stories don't perfectly parallel, it is reminiscent of it. And so Laban is going to say, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him a month, right? So there's at least a month stay. And this right here, bone, flesh, Adam says this about Eve when she's made from his side. He says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, which does connect this story in some way to the earlier Genesis creation story of mankind, which would be a fun study in and of itself. But we're trying to get through the chapter, right? Then Laban said to Jacob, because you're my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? So Jacob's been there a month. He's been welcomed in by Laban. He's processing everything that's happening. He likes Rachel, likes what he sees. And Laban offers him a job. He says, look, you don't need to serve me for nothing. Tell me, what shall your wages be? Like, if you're going to work and stay here, let's make sure you're paid fairly. Now, Laban had 2 daughters. So if we're to see this as a kind of just at least allusion and a callback to the Genesis story when Eve comes from Adam's side and Adam goes, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, then after that, we're told in Genesis 2 that I think this is before the formation of Eve. Either way, they're in the same chapter. It's where, and the narrative says in Genesis, and there was a tree, 2 trees in the middle of the garden. One was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The other one was the tree of life. And we're supposed to go, dun, dun, dun. That is setting the tone for where this story is going. Those 2 trees are going to come back into play, and they're going to be a focus of the story. I think in the same way here, now Laban had 2 daughters. It just reminds me of how Genesis 2 puts the pause on the narrative flow to make a statement about how there's 2 trees in the garden. One's forbidden, one's the tree of life. And there could be some connection beyond that here. But these 2 daughters are about to have a tremendous sibling rivalry over Jacob. And we're told who the name of the older is. The name of the older is Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Right? So Jacob can relate more to Rachel because he's the younger brother. He doesn't relate so much to Leah. Esau would because he's the older brother. right? So there's going to be a sibling rivalry that becomes very clear when it comes to the rest of this chapter. And that continues from the sibling rivalry we see with Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, or Jacob and Esau earlier. And now it's going to be Rachel and Leah. There seems to be this consistent pattern of two siblings competing for, reaching for something, feeling entitled to something. We're told Rachel's younger. Again, that's the one Jacob is attracted to. Just as 2 chapters ago, we're told that God ends up choosing the younger instead of the older brother Esau, right? Not to say that Jacob is God here, right? But God did choose the younger, and Jacob here is attracted as the younger brother to the younger sister. Leah's eyes were weak, which is a nice way of saying she isn't exactly attractive. But Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Now again, if we are to think about some kind of comparison being drawn, possibly, to the 2 trees in the Garden of Genesis 2 and 3, then this is actually what's said about the tree, is that it was good to look at. It was desirable to the eyes. So I think beyond the fact that we'll get into that later. Jacob loved Rachel. She's beautiful in form and appearance. It makes sense. And he said, I will serve you, Laban, 7 years. This is back to the question. What do you want me to pay you for your service? I'll tell you, give me your younger daughter, Rachel, and I'll serve 7 years, which is the number of completion in Scripture. Right? So there's a completion of service to earn the hand of Rachel in marriage. Why he comes up with 7, I don't know. Considering, again, the significance of the number 7 throughout the rest of the Bible, could refer to completion. Laban said, you know what? It's better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. So stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Right? There's this tremendous bond that's forming, more than just attraction. He wants her hand in marriage. So it seems as though Jacob serves 7 years as a shepherd, likely because of Laban's livestock or some kind of helping hand. Based on how the story is going to unfold, that's the responsibilities of Jacob. Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. Right? The work is done. It's time to have a wife. Let's build a family. Give me her hand in marriage. Give me your blessing. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. Right? So now we have a great feast, a celebration. And in the evening, he took his daughter Leah, brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban is tricking Jacob. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. So now Leah has a husband. Now Leah has a personal servant and handmaiden. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Leah, what is this you've done to me? She has weak eyes. I didn't serve for Leah. I wanted Rachel. Why have you deceived me? And Laban said, it's customary. It's not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. It's customary to give the older. I have a question. How did Jacob not recognize that it was Leah? Was he so drunk out of his mind because of the marriage and the feast before? What's happening here? How did he not know, but in the morning, that it's Leah? I don't know the cultural customs of the day and how that worked, but Jacob accuses Laban of cheating him by saying, what have you done to me? And we've seen earlier, that's what Esau says about Jacob deceiving him, right? Esau goes, what have you done to me? My brother has cheated me this 2 times. And then earlier in the Genesis story, if you remember, Noah, his youngest son Ham, however you want to pronounce it, he does something to Noah, and Noah is in a kind of drunken stupor. He doesn't fall asleep necessarily, but he's at least intoxicated by the wine. And Ham does something to him. When Noah wakes up, he goes, what have you done to me? With Cain and Abel. God comes to Cain and goes, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out from the ground. Or to Adam, what have you done? Who told you you're naked? So this is something that we've seen over and over again. Jacob is now getting cheated, just as he cheated Esau. So he's reaping what he has sown. He's getting out-deceived now. He's the one on the receiving end. Complete the week of this one, Laban makes an excuse. Laban has this all planned out. just complete the week of this one, which is 7 years, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. This isn't what Jacob signed up for. Jacob did so and completed her week. This is Rachel's. 7 years. Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel. So now Rachel and Bilhah given to Jacob. Jacob has acquired 4 women. You got Rachel, you got Leah, they're 2 servants. Things are about to get weird when you involve the handmaidens in the family feud. And so Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served Laban for another 7 years, right? So, Jacob has been here, 20 plus years now by the time we enter into verse 31 is going to recap what's happened over those years. But he's been here a long time. We saw in the last 3 chapters that Rebekah loved Jacob, right? While Isaac, their father, loved Esau because of what Esau could do. So there's a preferential love. Jacob has grown up in that environment of partiality and preferential love and favoritism with his parents. This doesn't mean that he doesn't love Leah, but he did want Rachel first, and it says he loves Rachel more than Leah. So we have someone that's overlooked, not as loved, not preferred, not the chosen one, but in the plan of God, she will be chosen to continue the seed of the Messiah. Jesus will come from Leah's line, not Rachel, because Judah comes from Leah. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel remained barren. Right? So Rachel's loved more, Leah's overlooked, but in God's plan, he chooses to give Leah children and lets Rachel remain barren. And the story of Genesis has shown several moments where God is directly stated as having taken notice of something and then acting according to that. If we remember, when God sees the man knowing good and evil in Genesis 3, God sees that and says we need to remove him so he doesn't eat from the tree of life. Or with the Tower of Babel, God sees what's happening and then responds. Or the flood story, God sees the wickedness of man and then he decides to bring the flood. Or God's sending angels to see the state of Sodom and Gomorrah. We've seen this time and time again. And he opens Leah's womb. This implies that Leah's womb was closed, right? That she couldn't conceive until God actually opened her womb. Rachel remains barren, and this is now the 3rd generation of barren women. We have Sarah, Abraham's wife, was barren. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, was barren. And now these 2 girls. And with each of them, God is going to miraculously open their womb and change their situation to bring life out of barrenness. Right? So God opens her womb in response to her being overlooked. But he leaves Rachel barren because Rachel's loved while Leah's not. At least not as much. And so the question becomes, did God do this so that Jacob would now love Leah? Or did God just do this to show grace and kindness to Leah and be there for Leah in this horrible situation, right? And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction. She sees this as affliction. God noticed me, and that's why he opened my womb. Now my husband will love me. What is she after? What does she want? She wants Jacob's affection. And she sees God's favor and God's blessing as a way to get other people to notice her, specifically Jacob. And she sees God's intervention as a means to accomplish that end, right? God is just a tool. In the mind of Leah, God is the way that I get Jacob to want me and love me and have affection for me. And God is just the helper here for Leah. She misinterprets God's blessing as being a way to get Jacob's love rather than being satisfied by the love God is showing her. And I think that's the purpose behind what God is doing, is not so that Jacob notices and wants Leah now, but so that Leah recognizes, hey, God notices me, and I should be content and satisfied, even in this rough situation, with the fact that God loves me and he sees me. And we have already seen someone, or God, look at someone who was forgotten and pushed to the side and overlooked, and that was Hagar, which we'll get to in a minute. So she conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard right? First the Lord saw, and now the Lord has heard that I am hated, which that word, again, refers to preferential love. I'm not wanted as much. I'm not the choice. He's given me this son also because I'm hated. And she called his name Simeon, right? So Simeon and Reuben are born out of that insecurity, that need for affection and Jacob's approval and attention. That's what they're born out of. And so now she goes, now my husband will love me in verse 32. I skipped that, which we talked about. So never mind. I didn't skip that. I did read that. I'm reading my notes. Verse 33, even Genesis chapter 4 will say something similar to what Leah says here. Right? Eve will say, I've gotten a man by God's help. And now Leah recognizes this too. God is my helper in this. So she at least recognizes God's intervening hand in this, but both sons are born out of affliction. So God is bringing life into the womb of Leah out of that affliction. It doesn't change Jacob's affection for her, at least that's not directly stated in the text. She just wants love, she wants to be wanted, and she sees children as a way to secure Jacob's love. So she's producing. If she can crank out enough children, Jacob will notice me and see that I'm giving him a future, and Jacob will want her and love her. Just as we've already seen Jacob's dad, Isaac, he loved Esau because of what Esau could do for him. Esau could cook and hunt, and he loved Esau for the meals that Esau would prepare him. Again, she conceived and bore a son. This is son number 3. Now this time, my husband will be attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. Leah, 3. Rachel, nothing. So she doesn't yet see the real purpose of these sons and God's intervening hand in her life. This is supposed to get her attention on to God with the end goal of being satisfied by the fact that God notices me, God loves me. Instead, she's obsessed with Jacob. And she's focused on producing and earning and achieving, whereas God is showing unconditional favor and love towards her that isn't based on what she can do because she's barren. He gives her life. And then she calls his name Levi. This is the priestly tribe of Israel. And he comes from Leah. Son number 3 is the priestly tribe. And then verse 35, she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time, and you're like, come on, Leah, like learn, I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, and she ceased bearing. It's like, you have enough kids, buddy. So by child number 4, she realizes God is worthy of my praise. God deserves my affection. She's been obsessed with what she doesn't have from Jacob. And she finally, by child number 4, notices God's presence and God's attention. Rather than overlooking God, she focuses on him. And this time it's not about producing for Jacob. It's not about gaining anything. Judah causes her to praise God alone. This son and the focus of this birth is God. God is ultimate in this. And again, we've already seen Hagar. God noticed Hagar, saw Hagar. Hagar's eyes were open to see that God sees me. This is a very similar thing happening with Leah. And this is back to Eve. Remember Eve when she produced the first son, the first human that came from the womb was Cain. And she goes, I've gotten a child by the help of God. And then by the time Cain kills Abel and she's childless because Cain's exiled, she bears another son named Seth, and her tune changes. Eve will essentially not view God as a tool to acquire a child or just a helper in the process, but she'll change her tune when it comes to Seth. And that's what Leah's done. So, again, that's the connection there. I think there's a lot of connections, actually, to the earlier portions of Genesis. God is not a means of an end, to an end. God is not a tool to gain other more valuable things. He is the treasure. He is enough. And in the middle of this sibling rivalry, fighting for the husband's attention and affection and limited time and all of that, we're told at the end that she ceased bearing. So what's interesting is Leah's pumping out kids. Then all of a sudden she ceases bearing. I wonder why. We'll see in the next chapter, chapter 30, what happens, what's born out of this, how this story continues. So hang around for the next session in Genesis 30, and I'll see you guys in that Bible study walkthrough. Mandrakes, divination, household idols, and pagan rituals. This is everything you find in Genesis 30. Maybe you never noticed that, but you're about to see why this is especially interesting. This story is all about a sibling rivalry and a fight for power and recognition. Two women are fighting over the same husband only to cause more chaos for themselves. And you're about to see how this is a mere reflection of Jacob and Esau's sibling rivalry in an earlier chapter. Maybe this type of Bible study is new for you, but I believe this chapter is about to come alive for you like never before. Hopefully you'll never read this chapter the same after this study. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 30. Since this is a Bible study on Genesis chapter 30, we're going to look at every single verse, read verse by verse, and we're going to pay attention to specific details in every single verse as we build up to the main point of this video. So you're going to have to be patient, you're going to have to work with me, and don't skip out on the rest of this just to skipping your way to the end, or you're going to miss the context, you're going to miss the framework for this chapter, and things won't make as much sense. So to keep things in context, the earlier chapter, if you haven't watched that video, chapter 29, Jacob is on the run, finds himself in Padan Aram, where he lives with his uncle Laban, works for over 20 years to marry one of his daughters, Rachel. Laban tricks Jacob, gives Jacob his other daughter instead, and Jacob finds himself married to two women, which isn't ideal. And one of those wives, Leah, ends up bearing children for Jacob, ends up having 4 children for Jacob, while the other one, Rachel, remains barren. And before all of this happens, Jacob does something cool, which I think foreshadows the resurrection of Jesus. So to summarize this chapter, Jacob's 2 wives are battling for Jacob's attention and affection. God regards both of them in different ways and gives each of them their own children. One of these kids will grow up to find some mandrakes, which is really odd because one of Jacob's wives really wants those mandrakes for a deeper reason. And in the background of all of this, Jacob's uncle Laban is growing jealous of Jacob's success and wealth. And Jacob realizes that he needs to leave before things get worse. And so what do mandrakes, divination, and paganism have to do with this story? You're about to find out. Verse 1 says, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. Right? Leah's pumped out 4 children. Rachel has none. She says to Jacob, right? She sees, then she says, give me children or I shall die. Dramatic much? She evaluated Leah's fruitfulness through a lens of personal envy and jealousy and selfishness. And so the way that she thinks about what she sees leads to a kind of desire for what Leah has, right? And we're now seeing the sibling rivalry that was displayed in Jacob and Esau earlier, Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, right? Esau saw that Jacob was blessed, and Jacob took his blessing. So Cain, or Esau rather, interprets that through the lens of selfishness and bitterness, and intends to kill Jacob. Right? Cain the same, saw that Abel was accepted by God and favored, and Cain grew bitter and desired to kill Abel, ends up doing that. And she says to Jacob, give me children, like Jacob is in control of that. She sees, she desires, and then she demands Jacob give her children. She reaches for what she doesn't have. And Sarah, in earlier chapters, was the wife of Abraham. Sarah saw that she was barren, and she told Abraham, since I don't have a child, since we don't have a future, here, and she takes Hagar and says, Abraham, sleep with my Egyptian servant. And in the same way, Genesis 3, Eve sees the fruit, desires it, and takes it. So there's a consistent, on the part of humanity, reaching for what a person doesn't have or thinks they need or thinks they're lacking. But it starts with seeing, and then desiring that, and then demanding they get that. And this is all about Rachel having children. She wants status, prominence, significance. This is not about Jacob having children. This is about Rachel. Give me children, because Leah has children. Jacob, you have children. I don't. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Which is really interesting. Because Jacob seems to think that God is withholding children from her. Is this Jacob's interpretation of the situation, and it's wrong? Or is God actually doing that? And why would God withhold children from her? Is it because of something she did? Likely, I think one of the most reasonable explanations is not just the way that God intends to display his grace and magnify his glory by doing what only he could do. But also, I think there is a personal reason why Rachel is actually barren, and it has to do with paganism and idolatry, as we'll see that she steals her father's household gods. And so when Rachel says, I'm going to die if you don't give me children, that's a little dramatic, right? But that's what Esau says a couple chapters ago. Well, when he comes in from hunting, he's starving, he sees Jacob making stew, and he goes, give me that food or I'm going to die. And I go, well, hold on, both of you, Rachel and Esau, why is that the only other option? Why is it eat or you're going to die? Or for Rachel, why is it have children or you'll die? Are you exaggerating? Are you serious? Either way, we have both sisters here looking at each other, right? Earlier in the previous chapter, Leah looked at Rachel being loved and wanted by Jacob, and Leah grows jealous and feeling overlooked, and God sees that. Now we have Rachel looking at Leah's fruitfulness, which resulted from her being overlooked in the first place, and now Rachel's jealous of what Leah has. So there's this constant struggle, sibling rivalry happening. And Rebekah, if you remember, was barren along with Sarah, now Leah, or rather Leah as well, and God filled all their wombs. And so here's what Rachel recommends. I don't have children yet. God's withheld from me. So here's my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, a kind of surrogate, that even I may have children through her. Rachel just wants kids. Doesn't matter how it's going to happen. She just wants her own kids. She's pulling a Sarah. This is like verbatim what Sarah says to Abraham after God gives them a promise. You're going to have kids. And she goes, well, it's been a long time. It seems as though God has not given us kids yet. So since that's the case, Abraham, here's my servant Hagar, my Egyptian servant. Go into her and we'll acquire a child by her. Same thing happening. Right? So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. This is reminiscent of Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham. And then in Genesis 3, Eve eats the fruit and gives to her husband, right? And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son, right? So it doesn't say she bore Rachel a son, but Jacob gets a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me and has heard my voice and has given me a son, right? So Rachel makes herself out to be some kind of victim. She's oppressed. She has no children. She's barren. God heard my voice. As God does hear the cry of the oppressed all throughout Scripture. He has several times in Genesis so far. God hears the blood of Abel crying from the ground against Cain. God hears the cry against Sodom and Gomorrah, the cry of the oppressed. They outcry against those cities. God hears the cry against the wicked generation of Noah, right? Blood being shed, the oppressed. And eventually God will hear the cry of Israel in slavery to Egypt, right? But my question is, Rachel goes, God has judged me. He's obviously for me. He's vindicating me. Is Rachel correct about this? Or is this just how she perceived things? Because she makes herself out to be the kind of oppressed victim here. And this will be very similar to the family feud we see later on with barren Hannah. In 1 Samuel, Hannah's barren. There's another competing wife who has children. She doesn't. And weirdly enough, she calls his name Dan. Her first son is named Dan. He's born out of competition, rivalry, jealousy, lack, right? And then he's born out of, Rachel giving her servant to Jacob to sleep with, taking things into her own hands. And weirdly enough, the tribe of Dan, they will not have a great reputation later on in the biblical story. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings, I have wrestled with my sister. I would love to know what she means by this. She thinks she's doing something. I've been fighting with my sister and I've prevailed. You ain't done nothing. You said, hey, I have a servant, Jacob. You guys should do the work and make me a child. So she called his name Naphtali. So we have 2 kids from Rachel's servant. We have 4 kids from Leah personally. That makes Jacob's family a grand total of 6 kids. For Rachel, Bilhah is nothing more than a tool. And then when she says, I've wrestled with my sister, there's this competition language, obviously. It's an image of how Jacob and Esau viewed each other competitively. They spend their lives wrestling with each other since they were in the womb of Rebekah. Remember that? And eventually in a couple chapters, Jacob will be wrestling, like actually literally wrestling physically with the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord will tell him that he's wrestled with man and has prevailed. Very similar language. And you don't see much of that language used of any other biblical characters except here, Rachel and Jacob. Jacob and Rachel are very similar in this way. Both are the younger siblings. Both are reaching for what they don't have as firstborns, They're overreaching, grabbing at the heels. Both are competing with their older siblings and end up wrestling with their fellow man to attain and achieve by their own efforts what they didn't previously have that they wanted, right? For her, it's kids. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, there's that evaluation again. Sisters are constantly assessing their performance and assessing how their numbers are doing. And I'm not bearing children. She took her servant Zilpah, just like Rachel did, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. She's like, I didn't know we're playing by these rules. I can give my servant to Jacob? All right. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune. That's important. It's like a pagan idea. Not just God has done good, but good fortune, good luck, has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. They named him Asher. Right, so we're up to a grand total of 8 children. 4 of those are from the servants. And I think this is a pagan idea of luck or fortune or whatever it ends up being. It's not exactly a biblical, theologically accurate idea. In the days of wheat harvest, now we're transitioning. With all this happening, Jacob's family growing, the feud getting worse, the servants getting roped into this. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben, remember the oldest, he went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. And then Rachel said, Leah, please give me. Well, it's all we've been seeing throughout the story is give me. Give me kids, give me affection, give me love, give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah says to Rachel, or rather, Rachel said to Leah. Now Leah is saying to Rachel, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? What's the deal with these mandrakes? Rachel said, good point. He can lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. Reuben's getting roped into this too. The children are being caught up in this. It's a very unhealthy family dynamic, right? And so this all happens in the days of harvest, wheat harvest. As we'll see in a minute, these mandrakes are actually considered to be good omens for harvest. That's why earlier Leah is said to be saying, good fortune has come upon me. Well, mandrakes are good omens, not just for harvest, but for wombs, right? Fruitfulness and having children and being able to conceive, which is another pagan idea. And so that's the cultural understanding of mandrakes and how that fits into their pagan ideology and worldview and how God works in their world. And Rachel goes, give me some of your mandrakes. Why? What does she want the mandrakes for? Because she's barren. And you want as many good omens, good fortunes, good charms, good luck charms for fruitfulness if you want to bear children. And this idea of give me some of your son's mandrakes, remember how much this story, their feud, parallels Jacob and Esau's story. Earlier, Esau said, a couple chapters ago, give me some of your stew, Jacob. Now, Rachel's desperate for mandrakes right after she just showed this obsessive desperation for children. They're just always reaching. It's never enough, right? It's never enough. And Rachel goes, tell you what, give me the mandrakes that your son found, little Reuben, and you can sleep with Jacob tonight. What's weird is that Rachel talks about Jacob as if he's her property to do with as she pleases, like she owns Jacob. And so we see a trade happening. Give me mandrakes, you can get Jacob. This makes it seem like Rachel keeps Jacob to herself all the time, and Leah never gets a chance to be with him to have more children, right? To kind of even the odds, Rachel's kind of keeping Jacob away, and Jacob does prefer that. And so he's not exactly opposed to that. So this is the kind of trade that Jacob made when he saw the opportunity with Esau. Esau goes, give me the bowl of stew. And Jacob goes, give me your birthright. Then I'll give you some stew. Now Rachel uses Jacob as incentive for Leah to give her mandrakes. So what is the significance of these mandrakes? Why is Rachel so desperate for them? Mandrakes are known to be an aphrodisiac, I think that's the way to pronounce it, involved in magic as a kind of fertility charm to bear offspring and to make one's womb fruitful. So Rachel wants children so badly. And she sees these mandrakes as a way to secure children, which reveals once again their pagan thinking and superstition. She wants this plant so badly that she'll sacrifice, not kill, but give up her husband for a night. And she does not trust God for kids. She is constantly taking things into her own hands. And do we not do the same? Where we take matters into our own hands. Things aren't working. Things aren't moving fast enough. So to secure my spot, I'll have to do it myself. Hey, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you on our website at abovereproachministry.com. Maybe you want to learn how to study the Bible. We have free Bible classes just for you. Are you maybe a newer believer? Go ahead and check out our Christianity 101 Foundations course. Maybe you hate videos. Well, we have a podcast, so you can listen to all of our messages on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Maybe you want to join or start a discussion group. Check out our map of all the current armed discussion groups all around the world. And do you maybe live near Greenville, South Carolina? If you do, you should check out our church. Visit movementchurchsc.com for more information. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, or head over to the donate page and donate through debit or credit card, PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or even mail a check to P.O. Box 509 Inman, South Carolina. And if you want to make a ministry connection, feel free to reach out to me on our website. All right, I know that was a lot, but I'm done. So let's get back to the video. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him. You must come in to me. I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. What a weird thing to come home to. Apparently this doesn't happen a lot. So he lay with her that night. And God what? God listened to Leah. God saw, God heard. Now God is actively listening. What did God listen to? I don't see any cry from her. I don't see any prayer. But we did see that God saw her earlier and gave her children. And now God hears her twice. And she conceives and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So his name was Issachar. So I think we're at number 9, kids, right? This is just so odd because she sees this child as her due. This is transactional. They're just trying to one-up each other. And Leah's kind of running behind. So she's like, well, I need to get more children. She sees her opportunity, and here's the transaction in her mind, where God's paying her back for what? For giving her servant to Jacob, which is a weird way of viewing the situation. It doesn't mean it's accurate. It's just describing how they're perceiving what's happening, how they're understanding these things that are taking place. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me. She's back to that whole thing. Because I've borne him 6 sons. Boom, we got Zebulun. We got 6 from Leah. We got 4 from the servants. We're up to 10. Rachel will provide the last 2. And then we'll see a daughter kind of caught up in the mix, right? Thrown in there. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. So, and she will be a huge focus of a future story. Then God remembered. See how active God is behind the scenes, though his hand isn't apparent as quickly as the sisters would want. It's not as evident. God is working behind the scenes. He sees, he regards, he hears, he listens, he remembers Rachel. And God listened to her and opened her womb. And again, my question is, what is it that God is responding to? Is there a cry going up that's not recorded? Is there a prayer that these women are praying? She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken my reproach away. And she called his name Joseph. The interesting thing is Joseph will end up in Egypt and will name his sons according to the kind of reproach that has fallen on him as being sold into slavery as a foreigner living in a land he doesn't belong to. So that will be reversed, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So Joseph is named in hopes of another son. Notice that it's never enough. I'm waiting for the next one. I'm looking ahead to the next one. And that's how many of us live. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, you know what? Could you send me away that I may go to my own home? He doesn't see this as his own home. And my own country. He doesn't see it as his homeland. My mother comes from here. I don't belong here. Give me, so now we got Jacob saying, give me my wives, my children, for whom I have served you, that I may go. You know the service I've given you. All these transactional moments throughout this story, man. We've seen this in the last couple chapters. Esau says, give me my blessing. Jacob says, give me your birthright. Rachel says, give me children. Leah says, give me my husband. Rachel says, give me those mandrakes. Just an example on repeat of how humanity is constantly desiring, reaching, and seizing what they feel entitled to. And why does Jacob speak to Laban as if Laban owns his family? Like, these are your women, your children. Why is he saying, give me? Is it because they're in his house under Laban's authority? But Laban said to him, if I've found favor in your sight, I've learned by what? Divination, which is interesting, that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Laban has come to know some secret knowledge. And as we saw earlier, Jacob views this whole thing as transactional. We'll come back to the Laban divination thing. But Jacob views this whole thing as like, hey, I worked for the wives. Leah's like, hey, I gave mandrakes for Jacob. Esau worked for his blessing, that kind of thing. It's this constant, I'm not just going to reach for, I'm going to earn. I'm going to achieve it. I'm going to do what's required to attain it. And Laban here learns by divination. He has pagan rituals, apparently. He's involved in paganism. But here's the interesting thing, is he seems to know the Lord God of Abraham. At least he honors God in some way. And so divination is obviously real here. This isn't some counterfeit. Laban gains legitimate insight. But the question becomes, is divination bad here? And is it being framed up as good? Or is it just describing what transpired? Because Laban learned of God's hand on Jacob through divination. He's looking at the favor going, how is it? By divination, Laban finds out, oh, God's hand of favor is on you. And we'll see eventually later in Numbers, there's this interesting seer named Balaam or Balaam. He interacts with the true God by divination. And again, the stories aren't making any kind of moral commentary on divination and saying it's good because they encountered God, or it's bad. We already see clearly in the law of God, like, divination bad. So we don't need the narrative to kind of comment on that. It's just describing what happened. He says, name your wages, Jacob, and I'll give it. Because Jacob's ready to go home, and Laban's like, no, I found out you're blessed. I want to keep you around, right? Name your wages. Jacob goes, okay. You know how I've served you and how your livestock has fared with me, right? You had a little before I came. I mean, Jacob ain't lying. And it has increased abundantly. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned, right? Laban is just experiencing the overflow of Jacob's blessing and favor. So God is allowing Jacob's blessing to, affect positively Laban and his household. And Laban notices, it's because I'm close to you, Jacob. And we're going to see that same idea with Jacob's son Joseph later on, where Joseph brings abundance and favor wherever he goes, into Potiphar's house, into all of Egypt, into the prison. I mean, the hand of God is on Joseph, and those in proximity to Joseph benefit from it. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? Like, I got to become my own family, bro. He said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. Here's what you'll do. Do this for me. I'll pasture your flock, and I'll keep it. Okay. Let me pass through all your flock today and remove all the speckled, all the spotted sheep, and every black lamb, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats, and that's what you'll pay me. That's an interesting request. And we're going to see in the next chapter that Jacob actually got this information, this wisdom, by a dream from God, just as Laban acquired information by divination. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come to look into my wages with you. Everyone that is not speckled and not spotted and not black among the lambs, if found with me, counted as stolen. This is going to foreshadow how Rachel steals Laban's household gods. Laban said, good, let it be as you've said. I'm just going to keep you around, man. Laban's very selfish in that way. Laban he doesn't seem to intend to follow through because he's going to end up going back on his word. But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black. So we see Laban trying to counter Jacob's plan and strategy. Laban's trying to make sure that he ends up on top and he ends up with more. And he put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. Whatever is left over, Jacob gets. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar, almond, and plane trees, peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. And he set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. This is back to the whole importance of watering the flocks and how much this plays a role in the story. Since they bred when they came to drink. So Jacob is wise. He's very cunning here. The flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped and speckled and spotted. Jacob here using the scientific method. He knows how things work. And then Jacob separates the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. He's very strategic in what he's doing. We're going to see in the next chapter, God has revealed these things to Jacob in a dream and gave Jacob insight to take advantage of the system and kind of put Laban in his place. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay these sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock that they might breed among those sticks, which have to do with what's produced. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there, right? So that they ended up being Laban's. So Jacob ends up with the stronger, right? So the feebler would be Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. What did Rebekah, when God told Rebekah what was happening in her womb with Jacob and Esau, do you remember what God told Rebekah? Because she's trying to make sense of it. He goes, the older is going to serve the younger, right? The stronger essentially will serve the younger, which will appear to be the weaker. That's happening. It's beyond Esau and Jacob. It goes into the favor God has placed on Abraham, and it actually involves the nations. Thus the man increased greatly, had large flocks, female servants, male servants, camels, donkeys. Jacob came to Padan Aram as one guy with a stick, or whatever it is that he brought. He doesn't seem to be traveling with a caravan or any servants. He just shows up. So God told Jacob he would increase him. Jacob did not expect this abundance and increase would come through Laban taking advantage of him and cheating him over and over. But God turns it around for Jacob's good. Right? There's an image right there of the gospel. But Jacob becomes great by his cunning and as he's done throughout his life. But this time, it involves some insight and wisdom from God. It's not just Jacob going rogue. It's God giving insight and wisdom to Jacob to employ in order to accomplish what God promised, that he would abound, he'd be increased greatly. In the next chapter, we're going to see one of the, if not the greatest foreshadowings of the Exodus from Egypt. In Genesis 31, when Jacob and his family are going to leave Laban's house and start heading home. But there's going to be a lot of things that get in the way, some troubles, some hurdles they got to find their way around. And that'll be a good study. So thanks for watching this study in Genesis 30. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any questions or thoughts, anything to add, anything you want clarified. I'd be happy to respond. So I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walk through in Genesis chapter 31. Genesis 31 is like a mirror image of Israel's exodus out of Egypt. What's interesting is that this story in Genesis 31 actually happened 4 centuries before the exodus out of Egypt. See, Jacob is about to pack his bags and move his family out of the land that he currently occupies as a foreigner. There's about to be 2 dreams from God and a whole lot of foreshadowing of the Exodus story. See, there's so much gold in this passage, and I missed it for years because I didn't know how to ask the right questions. But once we learn how to ask the right questions, you might see things that you've never noticed. Maybe this kind of Bible study is new to you, but I believe this small chapter is about to come alive for you in a way that maybe it never has before. And you will never read this chapter the same after this study. Let's jump in Genesis 31. Since this is a Bible study on Genesis chapter 31, we're going to read verse by verse and recognize some key details about every verse as we build up to the main idea of this video. I know there's some things you're anticipating, so be patient. Don't skip ahead, or you'll miss out on the entire context and the framework that you really need to understand those things. So just to keep things in context, the previous chapter, what happened was that Jacob's 2 wives are battling for Jacob's attention and affection, Leah and Rachel. God regards both of them and gives each of them their own children. One of these kids grows up to find some mandrakes, which Rachel ends up wanting for a deeper reason. And in the background, while all this is happening, Jacob's uncle Laban is growing jealous of Jacob's success and wealth. And Jacob realizes that he needs to leave before things get much worse. So we talked about the significance of mandrakes and divination and paganism. And in this story, chapter 31, you're about to see that God visits Jacob in a dream to tell Jacob, hey, it's time to leave. Laban's house is is not the place for you anymore. Time to head back home, right? So Laban and his sons are going to notice God's blessing on Jacob even more, and they grow resentful and jealous. And Jacob is going to have to secretly pack his bags and family and start heading back home. But after 3 days, Uncle Laban finds out, and Uncle Laban's going to track him down. And before Laban finds Jacob, God warns him in a dream to leave Jacob alone. The 2 will end up parting ways after making a covenant. And you're about to see why this story in particular might be the greatest and earliest, clearest shadow of the entire exodus out of Egypt. So it's like a copy and paste of that story, except this story in Genesis 31 happened around 400 years earlier, which is wild. So in Genesis 31, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, 'Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he's gained all this wealth.' And that's a problem, because for these sons of Laban, that is their stuff that they're going to inherit. And if their father doesn't have nothing, they won't have anything for their future to inherit." And Jacob's evaluating what's happening. He saw Laban did not regard him with favor as before, right? So Jacob's abundance is no longer benefiting Laban directly. So Jacob is now a problem for Laban and his family. Then the Lord said to Jacob, in response to what Jacob's evaluating, which is really cool if you think about it. Jacob notices something, but he doesn't exactly act on that suspicion. God confirms it in a dream, though. And he says, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." This isn't exactly where God speaks to him in a dream, but rather Jacob's about to talk about how God has visited him in a dream. Not just in chapter 28, but in the last chapter. So Jacob sent, and Jacob calls Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was. They're assembling in the field. And he says, "Look, I see that your father does not regard me with favor like he once did, but the God of my father has been with me nonetheless." Like God's decision remains the same. God's favor hasn't changed. And so what's interesting is in verse 3, back to verse 3 real quick, God tells Jacob to return to the land of their fathers, his fathers. And so the promised land is identified as belonging to Jacob's family and Abraham and their lineage and by promise. So though it hasn't yet been possessed by them, that will happen later on, the land he's currently living in, Padan Aram, is just the land of his mother, right? So God is telling Jacob when to leave. And a question we should ask is, was Jacob waiting for this direction in order to make a decision to leave? did this just happen so fast and so quickly? Because we saw in the last chapter that Jacob had intended to go. He's like, I need to leave, Laban. I got to have my own family. And Laban's like, stay a little longer, right? And his mother, Jacob's mother, 2 chapters ago, was like, hey, or 3 chapters ago now, said, you know what? When Esau no longer wants to kill you, Jacob, I'll tell you when to come back and when it's safe, all right? But apparently, it's not up to Jacob. It's not up to his mother. It's up to God. We won't hear anything about Rebekah from here on out. And so this is what God promised Jacob in the dream at Bethel in chapter 28. God promised that he would be with Jacob. God is with Jacob the same way he's with Abraham because God made a promise to Abraham, right? So you know that I've served your father with all my strength. Jacob assembles his wives, Rachel and Leah at least, not their maidservants, and he gives this speech. Listen, you know I've served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. Horrible circle, by the way. But God didn't actually allow him to harm me, right? So Jacob has kept track over the years how much abuse he's endured, how many times Laban has cheated him, and it's a lot, right? Jacob and Laban are both kind of deceivers, heel grabbers, cheating their way, scheming their way through life into blessings. And God has extended a degree of blessing, not just to Laban, but also to Jacob, irregardless of their scheming. Both don't deserve God's blessing, but both receive it. It's as if God has blessed Laban because of Jacob, and God has blessed Jacob because of Abraham, and God has blessed Abraham because he's gracious. And so God's blessing and favor can't be stopped. Or even accelerated by human deception and scheming. And Jacob is making it clear, what's happened to me didn't stop God's plan. He's still with us, and God didn't allow Laban to harm me, right? That's the only reason I'm alive. God allowed the cheating and the scheming, but he didn't allow Laban to hurt Jacob directly, which sounds like what God allowed Satan to do with Job in the book of Job. If he said the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God, like as Laban's changing the wages, going, every time I tell Jacob this is what you get, he gets way too much. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. Jacob is reiterating what the sons of Laban said in the beginning, right? This is how Jacob's evaluating the situation. God took Laban's blessing and gave it to me. Even though Laban attempted to cheat Jacob and steal and scheme, through that, God actually gave Jacob more at the expense of Laban. So Laban kind of made himself decrease by trying to cheat God's chosen partner. So Jacob was a blessing to Laban at one time, but now Jacob has essentially taken all that Laban had. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and I saw in a dream. This is one of the dreams in this chapter, besides the dream in chapter 28 with Jacob. And Jacob's kind of explaining how God brought about his abundance, right? I saw that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. And then the angel of God said to me in the dream, and by the way, this is going to be the angel of God he wrestles with in the next chapter, I believe. He said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, here is what you need to do. Based on what you're seeing, there's a response you should take. And he said, lift up your eyes and see all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. And God says, I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel. And so all the things that we saw Jacob doing in the last chapter, where he knew how to put the poplar sticks where the flocks were breeding, and that wasn't just something he'd learned through experience. Apparently that was divine insight that God gave him in a dream. And this is how we make sense of what he did, apparently. And God sees what Laban is doing to Jacob. I think that's incredibly important. As Jacob's explaining this dream to his 2 women, he goes, God came to me in a dream. And God has regarded those of low estate several times throughout this book of Genesis. God saw Leah was unloved. God saw she was barren. God saw Rachel was barren. God sees the oppressed and overlooked, Hagar being removed with Ishmael. And in the next 2 verses, we're going to see that Jacob and his wives are actually regarded as foreigners in Laban's house, right? So it's as if God is taking care of the foreigner, Jacob, in a land he doesn't currently belong to. And God makes it clear that what Laban does to Jacob it's oppressive. It's taking advantage of him as a kind of exploiting the foreigners, right? And the fact that God identifies himself with Bethel is incredible, because God is identifying with the place and what happened there, as if to remind Jacob of who God is and what God promised to Jacob. Right. So now Jacob's relaying all this to Leah and Rachel, making sense of why they're going to leave. And God said, "Where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me, yeah, I'm that God. So go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred." Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "We don't want to leave our daddy." No, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? The answer, no. Jacob's taken it all. Are we not regarded by him as foreigners along with Jacob? Right? So Jacob doesn't belong here, even though it's the land of his mom. He's not a citizen. He's a foreigner. He's not a native, for he has sold us. So this is Leah and Rachel answering Jacob. Jacob's trying to sell them on leaving, explain why and what's happening, and they're like, "We're with you." Like, he's indeed devoured our money. He sold us. He devoured our money. All the wealth God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. So whatever God said, do that. Right? So, when they say Laban regards us as foreigners, it's like, well, in what way? How do they see themselves being regarded as foreigners? Is it because they're treated as property and sold and their money's devoured? Is it because they have no inheritance? Is it all the above? And they say, like, all the wealth our daddy had, it's all ours, pretty much. So this is a kind of takeover. Jacob has plundered Laban and his house. And this isn't the first and last time that God will plunder the oppressor for the sake of the oppressed. We saw that with Abraham earlier a while ago, when he essentially won a battle between some kings, and he ends up with all the plunder and the spoil of war, and he gives it to Melchizedek, right? This isn't the first time, and this won't be the last time that God plunders the oppressor for the sake of the oppressed, which are usually his chosen people, right? So his daughters are essentially cut out of the will and inheritance, only to end up having all that wealth transferred to them because of their connection to Jacob. This is all about being connected to God's covenant partner, where God's favor and blessing is. And since they're connected to Jacob, they profit from his blessing too. Now, this is where things take a wild turn, as if they haven't already. So Jacob gets up, set his sons, his wives, on camels, and he drove away all his livestock. He drove away all his property, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, and they went to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. That's where they're headed. Okay. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. Question I have is, why does Rachel steal her father's household gods? Do we not yet see that there's only one true God that has extended favor and blessing to Jacob and his family, and has filled her womb and Leah's womb with children? Like, this is obviously the God of Abraham doing this. But Rachel's stealing, this is similar to the kind of trickery and stealing we saw where Jacob took advantage of Esau, right? And so far, when it comes to paganism in the story, we've seen divination. We've seen these pagan ideas of good fortune and mandrakes, which were a kind of fertility charm. And now we see household gods. So what we are seeing now is the people of the East are steeped in paganism. Even though they are being taken out of that land, Leah, Rachel, her maidservants, and they're going into a new land, it's going to be very hard to get those pagan ways out of them. You should be seeing many different allusions to the Exodus story and the nation of Israel in the wilderness. And Jacob tricked Laban, this trickster, the Aramean, by not telling him that he intended to flee. Now, the Arameans will end up oppressing Israel in the book of Judges at some point in their history. He fled with all that he had and arose, crossed the Euphrates, set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. Whew! Was this near Jacob's old home, where his father Isaac lives currently? Why is he heading towards Gilead? When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsmen with him and pursued him for 7 days, followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead, right? So Laban brings his fellow kinsmen, either it's his own army from his own household, kind of like what we see Abraham have when he chases the kings in chapter, I want to say 18, or this is just his fellow family in that land. But God appears to Laban. God came to Laban, the Aramean. And how did he appear to Laban, the Aramean? This is a very long chapter, by the way. Well, he appeared to him in a dream with my kids screaming bloody murder in the background. He appeared in a dream by night and said, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, good or bad." So God intends to stop this oppressor from pursuing Jacob by intervening through a dream. He warns Laban, just as God warned Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in a dream regarding Abraham a few chapters ago. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen. So we have all this stuff transpiring. Jacob is like, "Guys, we got to get out of here." His sisters are like, "We're with you." And they leave. Laban catches wind. It's like, "That's it. He took my daughters. Let's get him." And Laban finally tracks him down. And he finds Jacob in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban says, "What have you done? That you've tricked me." By the way, Laban, you've tricked Jacob a few times before and cheated him. So, it makes sense. "And you've driven away my daughters like captives of the sword." So they're regarded as foreigners. They're in the mind of Laban being treated as captives taken by the sword. "Why did you flee secretly?" This secrecy, this tricking. "And you didn't tell me so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs and tambourine and lyre." Well, maybe you're a liar, Laban. See, Jacob is up to his old ways of being a cunning trickster, and he has yet to grow out of this. And then Laban goes, "I would have sent you off for the celebration." And I just wonder, based off what the narrative has said about Laban and his sons, being jealous and envious and growing bitter, is Laban lying? Is he self-deceived? Would he really have done this? "Why didn't you permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? You have done foolishly." It's like, you made a mistake, Jacob. And I'm sure Jacob's like, "You made a mistake. It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me." I like how the way that God is addressed is in a pretty impersonal way. Laban doesn't have this reverential, personal, seemingly faith in this God, but he says, "The God of your father spoke to me in a dream last night, saying, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, good or bad.'" So Laban's explaining that. "And now you've gone away because you've longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" This seems to be the main reason Laban is chasing Jacob. Now, should we ask, is this the real reason? Or is this at least one of the main reasons? And it's at least one of the main reasons. But I think Laban gets right down to it. "Listen, someone stole my household gods. Why'd you do this? It's a huge deal." So maybe it's not the only reason, right? Maybe everything else was a cover, or this is a cover. I don't know his hierarchy of purposes here. But Jacob answered and said, "Laban, let me explain myself, okay? You explained your story. I was afraid. I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force." There's fear in Jacob's DNA. Jacob's grandfather Abraham lied to Abimelech and to Pharaoh about his wife Sarah because Abraham was afraid that they were godless and would kill him and would take Sarah. Now, Abraham's son Isaac did the same thing with the king of the Philistines because he was afraid of the king of the Philistines taking his wife Rebekah. Now Jacob is deceived, or rather deceives out of fear, right? So deception and fear run through this family very strongly. And this is involving the wives again, right? And if you remember in Genesis 3, after Adam sinned, God calls to Adam. And Adam goes, "I was afraid and I hid myself." So this hiding, this deception, this fear, it's the result of sin, and it plagues humanity. And Jacob said that, I think this is the key. I assumed Laban would take my wives. So Jacob acts on a maybe. Just as Sarah and Abraham, right? They're supposed to get a son, and God's promised them, and they're like, well, he hasn't filled your womb yet, so maybe God's going to give us a son through Hagar, the Egyptian servant. When humanity acts on a maybe, it doesn't really end well. But here Jacob and Laban are both defending themselves and explaining themselves, and anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. This is essentially, he's either making an official oath or he's just promising to Laban, like, let them die. And some would say this is why Rachel dies giving birth to Benjamin later, because of what he says and kind of brings it upon his own family, even though she brought it upon them by taking the household gods. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it. Go ahead, because Jacob knows, or at least thinks, that everything he has, he fairly earned. Now, Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen those gods, which means she shouldn't live. So what does this say about their relationship? Right? Everyone seems to have some secrecy and some secret fears and intentions going on. So Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent. He's digging around, looking into the tent of the two female servants. He did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent, entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods, multiple by the way, and put them in the camel's saddle. Right? She's hiding them in the traveling sack on her camel. And she sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but he didn't find them. And she said to her father, please let not my lord be angry. I can't rise before you. The way of women is upon me. What a great excuse. You can't. That's like the ultimate trump card. So he searched, but he didn't find the household gods. Then Jacob becomes angry and berates Laban. What is my offense, Laban? Like, after Laban's done digging around with his family, looking for his idols, which he seems to be obsessed with, enough to chase Jacob like a criminal, right? So that shows the paganism that's rooted deep in this people of the East. What is my sin that you've hotly pursued me? You have felt through all of my goods, right? Have you? What have you found of all your household goods? Nothing. Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I've been with you, Laban. Your ewes, your female goats have not miscarried. I probably mispronounced that. I don't know how to pronounce it. I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts, I didn't bring to you. So we're getting some great detail of Jacob's work history with Laban, right? What he had to go through for 20 plus years, what he had to endure, right? 20 years I've had to endure your crap, Laban. What was torn by wild beasts, I didn't bring it to you. I bore the loss myself. From my hand you required it, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night, which means Jacob's had to deal with people, or things rather, getting stolen. There I was by day, the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I've been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and then I served you 6 years for your flock, and you keep changing my wages. You did it 10 times. Like, this is Jacob's been waiting for this moment to just unleash on Laban. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac was not on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. So Laban was like, listen, if God didn't come to me in a dream, I would have torn you to pieces. And Jacob's like, no, if God wasn't on my side, you would have been missing out on a lot. So this is an interesting name for God, the fear of Isaac. Now, this is a name for God that only appears 2 times in the entire Bible, and both times are in this one chapter. This is a very unique name for God. It's very specific and significant to the situation. So why is this the name Jacob chooses to use to reference God by? You know, is it because Isaac feared God and now Laban has chosen to fear him too? Or God came and terrified Laban in a dream? Or that Jacob fears God, so Jacob hasn't done anything to Laban, even though he really wanted to, you know? This is a classic King David and Saul kind of story, right? If you know what I'm talking about. God saw my affliction, as we've seen, looks at the oppressed, notices that which is being taken advantage of, the sojourner, foreigner, the mistreated, the orphan, the widow, and the labor of my hands, and he rebuked you last night. Like, for me. Then Laban answered and said, Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine. This goes back to the question, what do I have that's yours, Laban? And you and I are going, nothing. And Laban goes, no, everything. This is the real issue. Laban is possessive. Laban is controlling. Laban cannot let go. But what can I do this day for these my daughters or for their children whom they have borne? Come now. You don't see that phrase a lot, but when you do, for example, you saw it with the Tower of Babel, you saw it with God making man, you saw it with God deciding to remove humanity from the garden, you saw it with really the sons of God that come into women in Genesis chapter 6. So the phrase carries a punch. Let us make a covenant, you and I. Let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone, set it up as a pillar in verse 45, right? So we saw this in chapter 28. Jacob had a stone under his head, fell asleep, had a dream in Bethel, right? And then set that up as a pillar. And this is just like Bethel, except it's not God's covenant with Jacob, but Jacob has a covenant with Laban. And I believe what we are seeing is another image of the Hebrew people having peace and having good relationship with the nations and the people of the East, the Gentiles, which Abraham and Isaac both displayed. Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones, and they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Now, this is not just some generic pile, but it likely indicates a kind of altar where sacrifices are made and a sacrificial meal is eaten. And either way, there is a covenant taking place, a covenantal meal of friendship and peace. Laban called it this, and Jacob called it Gilead. So there's obviously still disagreement. I'm going to call it this. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore, he named it Gilead. Did Laban name it? And he agreed with Jacob, and I was like, you know what, my name's stupid. I like yours. I don't know. And Mizpah. So we got three names. For he said, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. And watch what Laban is mostly concerned with in this covenantal oath. If you oppress my daughters, if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, God is witness between you and me. We got a protective daddy here, right? Laban obviously loves his daughters and cares for them, but how is it that Laban apparently at least honors the true and living God of Abraham, and yet he has idols and other false gods, and Laban is a mixed bag, right? He's got some paganism, but he acknowledges and even seems to fear the God of Abraham enough to recognize his hand on Jacob and make this covenant and be like, I don't want any trouble, right? Then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and the pillar which I've set between you and me. Take notice of it. This heap is a witness. We have two families making covenant. And again, it's the Hebrew people and the people of the East. It's a witness. I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and do harm to me. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by once again the fear of his father Isaac. Right? So Nahor, if you remember, is Abraham's brother, but also that's his grandfather's name, Abraham's grandfather. So the God of Abraham is identified as their God too, which is interesting. Laban appeals to God as judge, leaves righteous judgment in God's hands instead of taking things into his own hands like he's been used to doing. And here God is once again referred to as the fear of his father Isaac. God is to be feared and reverenced and worshipped and obeyed, and that seems to be a larger focus of this story. And Jacob offered a sacrifice. Once again, that heap of stones is likely an altar in the hill country, called his kinsmen to eat bread. So they're sharing in the covenantal meal. They're benefiting from this. And they ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Right? So this is a feast that's taking place, essentially. Early in the morning, Laban arose, kissed his grandchildren, kissed his daughters. He blessed them. And Laban went home. So now Laban, or they have Laban's blessing. A covenant has been made. The damage has at least enough been repaired. And here's where we'll end. This story, I know this is a longer video, but this is where things get, I just wanted you to get the overall context. We'll get an overview. And now you get to see how this story not only foreshadows the Exodus story in 15 different ways, but how this story is the earliest foreshadowing of the entire Exodus story put on full display. It's wild. So let me show you what I mean. If you go back, I think it's verse 6. In verse 6 and in verse 40 through 43, Jacob says, I'll try and show you, verse 41. We'll work our way backwards. He says, "These 20 years I've served you in your house." Now remember, the story of the Exodus is this. Israel is oppressed and enslaved to Egypt, this world power. The Pharaoh is killing the children and making sure that the Hebrew people don't grow too powerful. Moses is raised up after God hears the cry of his people. Moses is a prophet, does signs and wonders. God works miracles. God brings Israel out, and they walk through the Red Sea where the Egyptian armies get crushed by the waters. So that's the story. Jacob's time with Laban is for 20 years here is described in a very similar way to the way that Israel's time in Egypt is described when they're in slavery under Pharaoh. You know, Laban has cheated Jacob. Laban has changed Jacob's wages 10 times. Jacob was consumed, all this area right here, consumed by the heat of the day and the cold by night. He was sleepless nights. He didn't have enough sleep for the next day to work. I mean, exhausting, burdensome work for a cheating, oppressive, selfish, lying man. And then verse 43 explicitly will tell us, or 42, that God saw Jacob's affliction in that land, which is verbatim what God does for Israel. He sees their affliction, their oppression, and the master over them, and he intends to break them free. Now back to verse 2, okay? It says, Jacob saw Laban didn't regard him with favor as before. If you remember, in the beginning, Laban loves Jacob because Laban's benefiting from all of Jacob's blessings and stuff. But now that Jacob has grown and multiplied and taken a lot of what Laban has, Laban does not like Jacob. In fact, Jacob is a threat to Laban. That's what we see happen with the first Pharaoh in Egypt. Remember when Joseph goes in, he secures a spot for his family to come and be taken care of. That Pharaoh over Egypt is a good Pharaoh. They love Joseph and his family and Jacob and great relationship. But a new Pharaoh rises up, and that Pharaoh sees Israel as a threat through a jealous lens. Fast forward to verse 11, right? You have verse 11, "The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am," right? So God visits Jacob by the angel of the Lord to let Jacob know, I'm going to defend you and deliver you and bring you out of this land and back to the promised land, just as God visits Moses in a burning bush, and Moses turns to see the voice coming out of the bush, and God goes, Moses, I'm about to deliver my people, and I'm going to send you to bring them into the promised land. Look at verse 12. And he said, lift up your eyes, I see all that Laban is doing to you. Right? God has seen all that Laban has done to Jacob. He comes to his aid, almost verbatim what God tells Moses. I've seen my people. I've heard their cry. I'm sending you as the solution. And then verse 15, straight out of the woman's mouths, aren't we regarded as foreigners here? Now watch this. He sold us. He's devoured our money. That's Laban, right? Laban is a kind of, in this story at least, a kind of parallel to Pharaoh, right? It seems as though Jacob and his wives here aren't very much regarded as, they're regarded as foreigners, right? His real heritage, by which he's identified, is not his mother's homeland, but Abraham's land that they're going to possess, the promised land that God gave to Abraham and his descendants. Just as Israel, again, was foreign to the land of Egypt, they're the oppressed foreigner being taken advantage of. And then they say, all the wealth God has taken away from our father belongs to us now, right? So God has plundered Laban by giving his wealth to Jacob and his family. And Israel will do the same to Egypt. When they leave, they end up, when they flee after the final sign, the firstborn taken in Egypt, and Israel gets up, and the Egyptians actually give them a bunch of treasures and gold and silver, and essentially Israel's plundering Egypt on their way out, right? And here we have Jacob and his family fleeing from Laban after having plundered them on the way out. Verse 19, I think this will become even more clear. These are just a few up front. Laban has gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. Right, so Rachel brings these false gods and idols with her on the journey back to the promised land, just as Israel seems to do at the Exodus, when they appear to have taken the gods of Egypt with them, or some idols, and they end up fashioning even at the gold they brought out of Egypt, using that to turn into a golden calf and worship that. And then verse 21, it actually says, he fled with all that he had and rose and crossed the Euphrates. Right, so in both stories, there's a crossing of a body of water. Israel crosses the Red Sea to flee into the promised land. Jacob here is fleeing across the Euphrates from Laban. Right? Verse 22, when it was told Laban on the third day Jacob had fled, he ends up pursuing Jacob into hill country of Gilead. And so there was a 3-day journey actually between Jacob and Laban here, right? Just as Israel was supposed to go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship God, but Pharaoh wouldn't let them. Finally, he lets them go. And so once Laban finds out, he chases Jacob. Well, in the Pharaoh story with Israel, Pharaoh hears Israel's wandering, and he intends to chase them down and bring them back into captivity. Verse 24, God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream by night. And God personally warns Laban not to mess with Jacob. And you know what God did repeatedly to Pharaoh? Through Moses, through the signs, repeatedly warned Pharaoh, let my firstborn go. Don't mess with Israel. That's my firstborn son. And then he'll split the Red Sea and crush the armies of the Egyptians. And then if you look at verse 18 through 22, which you can look at on your own, Jacob's leaving is actually framed up as like leaving hastily, trying to flee. Just as we see Israel, like they leave in haste in the middle of the night, fleeing from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh. In verse 43, weirdly enough, Laban is going to answer and say, these are mine, but what can I do this day for these children, their children whom they have borne? Sorry, that's not the right verse. It's right here. God's seeing the affliction, which I already touched on. God is seeing the affliction of Laban on Jacob, and God does the same to his people Israel by protecting them from Pharaoh. And then later on in chapter 35, in about 4 chapters, we're going to see God calls Jacob and his family to give up their pagan ways, to give up the culture and the idols that they lived in for 20 years and leave it behind, right? Just as Israel is instructed to do on their way out into the promised land, they're called to be a new people. Give up these idols. Give up this paganism and idolatry. And then Jacob is going to be told to go up to Bethel, which is a high place to worship the Lord and build an altar there. Just as Israel, on their way out of Egypt, will be instructed to go to Sinai on their way out of Egypt, and essentially go up the mountain Moses, come down, build the tabernacle, worship the Lord there. So worship and altars and sacred space are on the way out. And then the last thing is this: Jacob and his family will eventually be told that it'll be said in the narrative that God put the terror of himself on the surrounding cities so that they wouldn't harm Jacob and his family as they're sojourning and traveling. And that same idea is true of Israel when they come out of Egypt, because all the nations see a very vulnerable, fragile, newly formed nation, and God puts the fear of the Lord on them so they don't touch Israel. So, I mean, there are probably more beyond that I had touched on. This kind of idea of, essentially Laban represents what Pharaoh could have had. Right? Pharaoh could have made a covenant with the people of Israel, could have let them go, could have been good relationship. Instead, he didn't. He didn't fear the God of Isaac and Abraham and Jacob. And so there's a lot of tricking and cunning and scheming and oppressing and taking advantage, and God seeing the foreigners. And also the idea of them being sold is interesting The daughters view themselves as being sold, just taken advantage of for the purposes of Laban. And then Pharaoh, that's essentially how he treats Israel, as not just the firstborn of God, but in that covenantal sense, the bride of God. And so God regards, God sees, God visits, God essentially steps in, intervenes, pulls them out. All these different things I think are great parallels to the Exodus story, which is really cool. There aren't many stories like this where it's like so many details parallel that Exodus narrative. So if I missed something, let me know in the comments. I love seeing things that I didn't previously, or maybe things becoming clearer. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, insights, share those in the comments below. And I'll see you guys in Genesis chapter 32, where we will continue this study throughout Genesis. And eventually, hopefully, by the end of 2024, we'll have finished all of Genesis. That's the goal, all right? I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more biblical content just like this. We have hundreds of videos, but you might be most interested in these ones right here. Also, visit our website for all of our free resources and classes. And thank you so much for partnering with us financially to make this ministry even possible. Keep moving towards Jesus, and I'll see you in the next video.